The objective for this experiment is to determine the coefficient of static friction of different surfaces. Apparatus. Number 1 is wooden block, rubber covered at one side, 50 gram masses, 10 Newton spring scale, string and tabletop. For procedure number 1, the mass of wooden block that was recorded as M was measured. The apparatus was set up as shown in figure 5.2. The tabletop was made sure to be stable and horizontal to the ground. And then the spring scale and the wooden block was attached to a string. A mass of 50 gram was placed on the wooden block. The spring was pulled slowly. Once the block started to move, the spring scale's reading was recorded. The value was recorded as Fs and was tabulated in table 5.1. Step 4 until 5 was repeated for 3 trials. Another 50 gram of mass was added on the block, and the step 5 and 6 was repeated. The steps were repeated until the total of M equal to 500 gram is on the wooden block. Step 1 and 8 was repeated, but this time the rubber side of the block was facing upward. The data was tabulated in table 5.2.
Next is theory. Force and velocity are vector quantities that have both magnitude and direction. Velocity is the speed in a specified direction with which a given object is traveling. Force exists when the object accelerates or undergoes a change in its velocity. A body at rest or in equilibrium exhibits resultant force, or the sum of all forces acting on the body is zero. Gravity is an attractive force that exists between two masses. The magnitude of the force depends on the magnitude of the mass. The gravitational force that acts on an object on Earth is approximated as Fg equal to mg, where m is the mass of the object and g is the gravitational acceleration. The magnitude of the gravitational force exerted on an object is referred to its weight. Normal force is a contact that acts in normal direction or perpendicular to the contact surface between two objects. Friction is the force that resists relative motion of one surface in contact with one another. There are two types of friction, static and kinetic. Static friction is the friction that acts on an object that is at rest. Static friction is the force that must be overcome in order to move static object. The maximum value of static frictional force is given by Fx max equal to mu Sn, where mu s is the coefficient of static friction and n is the normal force. The coefficient of static friction is a dimensionless constant that depends on the object and the surface it is laying upon. Kinetic friction is the friction that acts on a moving object, and the kinetic frictional force is given by Fk equal to mu Kn, where mu Kn is the coefficient of kinetic friction and n is the normal force. In this experiment, the frictional force between a wooden block and the rubber surface on a horizontal inclined plane will be measured. From the plotted data, the coefficient of static friction will be obtained.
Questions: how can anti-lock brakes stop a car in a shorter distance than regular brakes? Anti-lock braking systems stop a car in a shorter distance than regular brakes by preventing the wheels from locking up during braking. When the wheels lock up, the car skids and static friction is replaced by kinetic friction, which is lower. From your experiment, which material has the highest coefficient of static friction? Does this agree with the hypothesis? What do you think determines the coefficient of static friction? The material that has the highest coefficient of static friction is the rubber surface. This agrees with the hypothesis that materials with more frictional properties will have a higher coefficient. Once the mass begins to slide, does it move smoothly or does it undergo stop and go motion? Explain the motion. Once the mass begins to slide, it may undergo smooth motion or stop and go motion. For example, for smooth motion, if kinetic energy is relatively constant, the mass will move smoothly. For example, for stop and go motion, if there is significant variation in kinetic friction, the mass may alternate between sticking and slipping. This occurs if the surface have irregularities or there are variations in normal force.
From this experiment, we know that the coefficient of static friction is the measure of how much resistance there is when two surfaces are in contact with each other. The result for the experiment revealed that frictional force increased proportionally with the normal force, which is consistent with the theoretical relationship. This behavior is attributed to the fact that the frictional force depends on the weight of the object pressing against the force, as well as the nature the contact surface. According to the result, a wooden block with rubber surface has a greater coefficient of staticity than a non-rubber surface. There are also some human error in this experiment, such as instrument error and surface error. The improvement that we could do is perform more trial for the experiment.
In conclusion, the coefficient of static friction of different surfaces was determined. Friction is a force that acts in the opposite direction from body motion. The coefficient of friction, static or kinetic, is a material property and varies based on the surface combination.